Ave Maria, gratia plena, Dominus tecum, benedicta tu in mulieribus, et
Hello, Father Mark from Presentation Church, speaking to you once again about the wonderful apparitions of Our Lady of Fatima. Today, I would like to just speak a little bit about why it is, perhaps, that Our Lady appeared on the 13th of each month. Some people might think it's kind of strange, usually an unlucky number. Our Lady appeared in 1917 to the three children every month for 6 months from May through October, and always she said on the 13th. So why would that be? Well, in the Bible, we know that the number 12 is a very holy number, a very sacred number. It's the number of the 12 sons of Jacob, whose name also was Israel. So it's the number of Israel, the people of God, the 12 tribes, the 12 families. And so God's people, God's chosen people is 12. So 12 is a good number. And in the New Testament, of course, Jesus picked 12 apostles. And so it's the number of God's family, God's chosen people. And so perhaps the number 13 became kind of an unlucky number because obviously if you're number 13, you're left out a little bit from the collection of the 12 of the family. And perhaps the significance of that is that Our Lady of Fatima, of course, appeared for the nation. She appeared at the edge of Europe, the far western coast of Europe, kind of the faraway lands, and she spoke to three children, but she also spoke to the whole world. The message was largely regarding the world wars, the First World War, and then she predicted the Second World War. So obviously Mary very concerned about not just the Jewish people, but all of God's people. But perhaps there is another reason why Our Lady chose the number 13, or the 13th of each month, to appear. And that would be something which is actually found in the Bible. And it is from the Book of Esther. I have been amazed recently to read some articles about the fact that there are amazing correlations between the apparitions of Our Lady of Fatima and the Book of Esther in the Old Testament. For me, it was fascinating to think that it seems that the apparitions of Our Lady of Fatima were actually foreshadowed or anticipated in the Bible, even in the Old Testament of the Bible, in the Book of Esther. Now, to find the similarities between Fatima and the Book of Esther, you'll have to use your Catholic Bible. Now, if you use a non-Catholic Bible, I have one here, you may know that certain books were excluded by Luther and the Reformers. Some of the books were shorter. For example, in the non-Catholic Bible, you have a shorter version of the Book of Esther. That's because the longer version was actually not available in Hebrew for many centuries. And so the Reformers, they thought that it wasn't as ancient, wasn't as authentic. However, since then, archaeologists have found copies of the longer version of Esther in the ancient language of Hebrew as well. So both versions are, we believe, of course, as Catholics, legitimate. Another reason why Catholics prefer the longer version of Esther is because only the longer version of Esther talks about God, and it has lots of long prayers. So if you have a Catholic Bible, you will have the whole story. Sometimes it will seem that the numbering of the chapters is a little different in each Bible, or some of the chapters might be identified with letters instead of numbers. This is because there are these two versions, a shorter version and a longer version. However, everybody loves the story of Esther. The shorter version in the Protestant Bible just has the simple story, just the action, what happened to Esther and how she saved her people. But the Catholic version has those longer prayers. But we believe, of course, that both of them represent, in a mysterious way, the Blessed Virgin Mary, and how she became a queen, this humble maiden who became a queen, and then was able to intercede with the king and save her people. It's a perfect example of Our Lady for us who are Catholics. Now, I'm not going to describe the whole plot, the whole story of what happens in the Book of Esther. In order to get a summary of the Book of Esther, I would recommend that you go onto the internet and find some little YouTube videos which are very entertaining. Actually, they are done by non-Catholic Christians, I believe, but they are delightful, and I would really recommend watching them, especially for children, for example, to learn about the story. One of them is very simple, kind of a cartoon version. You would search for Tailrace Kids Bible Story Esther. The YouTube channel is available there on our website. And another one is called the Bible Project, Overview Esther. And this is a wonderful version as well of an explanation of the Book of Esther using drawing. And it's a very good explanation of the plot of the Book of Esther. As we know, the basic story of the Book of Esther is that she was this innocent, beautiful young lady who had lost her parents, and so her foster father, Mordecai, cared for her. Meanwhile, in the castle on the hill in this Persian city of Susa, where the Jewish people were exiled, Esther and her foster father were actually Jewish, but the king, Xerxes, he was unhappy with his queen and wanted to find a new queen, basically. And so he had basically a beauty contest, or he invited all the young ladies, and it turned out that Esther as well was brought to the castle, to the king, and she was chosen as the queen and crowned. And so this is a story, of course, of the exalting, of the raising up of the lowly. And so that's the first of our little indications that it seems to be an image of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And the story continues that the king had a prime minister, or a second in command, whose name was Haman, and he was very wicked and self-serving, and he wanted to have all the glory and attention, and the king, in fact, ordered everyone to bow down before him, but of course the Jewish people refused. And so Mordecai refused, and Haman became so angry that he decided to have all of the Jewish people in the entire kingdom killed. And they cast lots, and the date for the genocide was the 13th of the month of Adar. So there you have, again, a similarity between the Book of Esther and the apparitions of Our Lady of Fatima. The people were in grave danger, and the 13th of the month was the day when they were to be destroyed. And so you can already see the connections between the Book of Esther and the apparitions of Our Lady of Fatima, because obviously when Our Lady appeared during World War I, the world was on the verge of destroying itself. In fact, the Pope, a week before the first apparition of Our Lady of Fatima, the Pope had written a letter to the world imploring the leaders of the world to bring peace, and it was exactly 7 days later that Our Lady appeared. So let's begin now just looking at a few of those examples. First of all, looking at the things that we see in the story of the apparitions of Fatima, and seeing if we can find those same things in the Book of Esther. And you can decide for yourself if you think there might be some correlation. Well, obviously the first thing is that strange detail that Mary appeared, she wanted to appear on the 13th of each month. That, for me, is just pretty clear that it might have something to do with this Old Testament Book of Esther, where there was this great fear of destruction on the 13th of the month of Adar in the book. Another detail that we find in the story of Our Lady of Fatima is when you look at the image of Our Lady of Fatima, and I've got a real statue of Our Lady of Fatima instead of Our Lady of Lourdes behind me now, but Our Lady of Fatima appeared in this way, dressed in white. She actually didn't have a crown. The Portuguese people who love her so much, they put the crown on, and they created this beautiful statue. Actually, the statue was created, Lucia asked a Dominican priest who was an American and an artist to make the statue, and she described Our Lady of Fatima to him, and he took down notes, and he created this statue. One of the things that our Lucia told this artist, this priest, was that there was a little star always at the hem of her garment, and you can see here this little star right there. Every statue of Our Lady of Fatima has that little star, and so Lucia said, yes, a yellow star was always shining there at the base of her garment. And so the priest wrote it down, and he said, okay, yeah, a golden star. And he's already thinking of what he's going to make his, no, yellow. And the priest was surprised. No, it was yellow and not golden. That was very interesting. So that little detail is something that we find in the apparitions of Fatima. Now, where do we find that in the Book of Esther? Well, it's interesting to note that Esther herself, her real name, her Jewish name, when she was growing up with her foster father Mordecai, her real name was Hadassah. But then when she went into the court of the king, in this Persian court, they gave her this new name, which was Esther, and Esther in Persian means star. So it's pretty clear that if Our Lady of Fatima has a star and she's appearing on the 13th, there's already seems to be some connections here. Amazing little connections. Amazing when you think about the fact that during the Holocaust, the Jews were forced by the Nazis to wear yellow stars to identify themselves as Jews who were to be executed. And of course, Our Lady at Fatima was appearing precisely to warn the world about World War II. And since Mary was Jewish, she was probably wearing that yellow star at Fatima to show her solidarity and compassion toward her own people. Another detail in the apparition of Our Lady of Fatima, which is not just a detail, it's a pretty glaring thing, and that was the great miracle that Mary promised, that miracle of the sun. That the sun was suddenly visible through the clouds, they could look at it without any discomfort, and for 10 or 15 minutes everyone saw the sun dancing in the sky and spinning and changing colors, and people in neighboring villages, 70,000 people saw this incredible miracle of the sun, which was the greatest miracle of modern times, in fact the history of the world. And they say it's the only great miracle which was ever predicted that it would happen. The only other one would be the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus promised he would rise from the grave. And here we have this incredible miracle of the sun. Now, do we find something similar in the Book of Esther? Well, in the Book of Esther, in the Catholic version, it begins with a dream. Mordecai, the foster father of Esther, has a dream. And he has this mysterious dream, which is only really explained at the end. There was noise and confusion, he says, and behold, two great dragons came forward, ready to fight, and they roared terribly. And behold, a day of darkness and gloom, tribulation and distress, affliction and great tumult upon the earth. And they cried to God, and from their cry, as though from a tiny spring, there came a great river with abundant water. Light came, and the sun rose, and the lowly were exalted. That sounds like Mary's Magnificat, of course, that God has lifted up the lowly. And so Mary, of course, was lifted up and became queen, and also Esther was lifted up and became queen. So it's a prophetic dream, but all of this struggle between two dragons, later we're going to find out that that is the struggle between Mordecai, her foster father, and Haman, the number 2 in command in the kingdom of Susa there. And at the end there'll be a big reversal, because Mordecai will take Haman's place as number 2 in the kingdom eventually in the story. So that's a very beautiful story, a reversal that happens at the end. But these words of describing a dark and gloomy day, and that suddenly the light of the sun broke forth, and the lowly were exalted. This also is very interesting because, of course, we know that the apparitions of Fatima were all about light. There was flashes of light, light shining through her garments, brilliant light coming from her hands that brought them the presence of God and opened up the earth for the vision of hell. This light that came forth from Our Lady, and then, of course, the miracle of the sun. And the miracle of the sun happened in 1917 in October, when for several months there had been this huge rainstorm all over Europe, and there was a terrible battle of the mud, the Battle of Passchendaele in Belgium, and 2 armies in thick mud and mud puddles, just mud and blood, just a terrible battle. And it was the same weather front that was causing the rain also in Fatima on that day. And so for the world to be engulfed in this terrible storm and this war and this darkness, and then only one spot, you might say, at Fatima did the clouds part and the sun appear. So another important aspect of the apparitions of Fatima is that just like Queen Esther, Our Lady of Fatima is able to intercede for the people and to pray to the great king and intercede and obtain salvation and protection for the people. And this is very evident in the 3rd apparition of Our Lady of Fatima. You may know that the 3rd secret of Fatima was this great vision that the children saw of all of the horrors of the 20th century, all of the martyrdoms, the attempt to assassinate the Pope, all of those things were seen. But also there was this image of the fiery wrath of God because of the seriousness of sinfulness, represented by an angel with a fiery sword. But there was, in their vision, light coming from Our Lady's hands that intercepted and stopped the fire that was coming from the sword of the angel. An incredible, it sounds like superheroes from one of those superhero movies that the young people love to watch now. But this cosmic battle, but Our Lady with her divine light, this light from God coming through her hands, is able to stop and protect the world from punishment. And the angel called out in this vision, penance, 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 as something that was necessary to save the world. Now we can ask, do we find something like that in the Book of Esther? Well, it's very clear that Esther is Jewish, but she becomes the queen, but nobody knows she was Jewish. And then there comes this edict that all the Jewish people are to be killed. And so Esther has to do something to save her people. And Mordecai, her uncle, who's always outside the castle at the gate, kind of watching out for her or inquiring about her, and he is there faithful. They sends messages back and forth, and Mordecai tells her, you have to do this. And he says something interesting. He says, do not imagine that you are safe in the king's palace, you alone of all the Jews. Even if you now remain silent, relief and deliverance will come to the Jews from some other source. But you and your father's house will perish. And so Mordecai says that God's going to save his people. You know, you might as well be the one to do something and to be the cause of the salvation. And then Mordecai adds, who knows, perhaps it is for a time like this, that you became queen. So obviously Mordecai is saying that in God's providence, she became queen precisely so that she can help her people. Now that is a beautiful image of the Blessed Virgin Mary, that the Blessed Virgin Mary, this humble, lowly virgin from Nazareth, was exalted by God, and now she's above the angels at the right hand of her Son as queen. And why is she there? not just for her own health, she's there for us, to intercede for all of us. It's precisely what she does as Our Lady of Fatima. My favorite parts of the book of Esther are those dramatic scenes where Esther has to go into the presence of the king, and there was an ancient Persian law that no one could enter the king's chamber without permission, and if they tried to do so, then they would be killed immediately, unless the king extended his scepter, his royal staff. If he extended it, then that person would be allowed to enter. But to enter without permission on your own was punishable by death. And so Esther hadn't been summoned for some time into the king's chamber, so she took the supreme risk of going there. And it's very powerful. This image, actually a description of the king, is something like the glory of God. You know, in the Old Testament, it speaks of God as a fire of justice and something that you can't see the face of God and live. God is holy, 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 and we'd have to be perfectly pure in order to be in God's presence. Well, it speaks of the king's face as being like on fire, and that he's most terrifying here in chapter 15. And so it says that Esther began to falter. As she entered, she turned pale and faint, and she collapsed. And I love that. I just imagine, her fainting as some women might faint. So she faints, and she's starting to faint, and she's falling into the arms of her maid, her servant who is escorting her. But as she's falling, suddenly it says that God changed the spirit of the king to gentleness. And in alarm, he sprang from his throne and he took her in his arms. So I can just imagine the king running down the steps from his throne and sliding and catching Esther in this dramatic scene. And he took her into his arms until she came to herself. And he comforted her with soothing words and said to her, "What is it, Esther? I am your brother. Take courage." Well, he was her husband, obviously, but I guess that's how they talked back then. She said, "Do not be afraid. You shall not die. Come near." So he obviously welcomed her, and then she was able, in the rest of the book, to make those efforts to let the king know that this advisor of his was not so good after all, that this wicked Haman was trying to kill her people and her as well. And eventually the king realizes, and the king has Haman put to death, and Mordecai becomes exalted. It's very interesting that before Esther entered the presence of the king, there was always a certain preparation that had to happen. And this, can relate to our belief in purgatory, for example, or the purification that we do in this life to prepare ourselves to be in God's presence. And of course we know that there are two things that are important in order to see God and to be with God, and that's prayer and penance. Those two things, prayer and sacrifice. And those are the two main aspects of the apparitions of Our Lady of Fatima. She really called people to pray the rosary. She says, "I am the Lady of the Rosary." And also penance. She spoke about sacrifice and fasting and prayer. And so before entering the king's presence, Esther puts on sackcloth, she takes off her crown and her robes, and she wears rough clothing, and she does this penance and sacrifice, and she fasts. And in fact, she sends a message to Mordecai, her foster father, and tells him to fast. That's interesting. And the only time in the book of Mordecai's always telling her what to do. Only one time does she tell him what to do. That is, she tells him and all of the Jewish people to fast for her before she would go into the presence of the king. And so this is very interesting because Our Lady of Fatima obviously is calling the children and all of us to fasting from food or from comfortable things sometimes in order to offer up these little sacrifices to God. It's also very interesting that in the book of Esther, when it came to that beauty contest that the king Xerxes wanted to find a new queen, and all of the women of the kingdom were lined up, and they all came into the kingdom, and there was actually a year-long sort of preparation for these beauty queens before they could enter the presence of the king one by one. In fact, in chapter 2, it says that all of the women had to pass this period of their beautifying, being beautified, 6 months with oils, with the oil of myrrh, and 6 months with spices or ointments for women. So there was these two periods of preparation. The first with spices or incense or perfumes, you might say. And that in the scriptures is usually a symbol of prayer. Incense, obviously, when the three kings came to offer incense to the baby Jesus, it was a gift that represented prayer. It was what was used in the temple as well. Incense was used. Something sweet smelling for God is like prayer. And now oil, myrrh, using oils, oil also, when the three kings brought the myrrh, that was a symbol of suffering and of death, because oil was used for people who are sick, for curing and for embalming. It was something for bodies. It was something representing suffering or the physical pain and death, those kinds of things. And so these two processes, or these two preparation periods, could very well symbolize those two important aspects of Fatima, which were prayer and penance. I would just like to conclude with one more similarity between the Book of Esther and the apparitions of Our Lady of Fatima. You know, when the Blessed Virgin Mary appears in different places, sometimes there are miraculous springs of water, and that happened at Lourdes especially. We remember the miraculous spring that caused so many miracles of healing. But at Fatima, there is no emphasis, it seems, during the apparitions on any kind of miraculous spring of water. But it does seem to be part of the Book of Esther. In the Book of Esther, it actually begins and it ends with that dream of Mordecai, which speaks clearly about a tiny spring that becomes a mighty river and a flood of water. And this is very interesting. And then at the end of the book, there is a kind of an interpretation of the dream. And Mordecai said, "All of this is the work of God. I recall the dream I had about these very things, and not a single detail has been left unfulfilled. The tiny spring which became a river, and there was light and the sun and abundant water. The river is Esther, whom the king married and made queen, and the two dragons are Haman and myself." So Mordecai, at the end, he understands his dream, that this struggle between himself and Haman, the two viceroys or second in command, that they are represented by these two dragons that fight one another. But what about this emphasis on the river and the abundant waters? Well, again, at Fatima, if you go there today, it's this big esplanade and it's all very dry. It's not like Lourdes where there's this big river and there's this spring and so much emphasis on water. Well, at Fatima, there's not. However, it is very interesting that the last detail of the last apparition of Fatima is water. Because Lucia, when she became a nun, the rest of her life she lived into old age. She had several other visions while she was in her various convents. And while she was in a convent in Spain, in a place called Tuy, T-U-Y, she had this incredible vision in her chapel, and it was very elaborate. She said she saw Christ crucified above the altar. Under the right arm of the cross was Our Lady with her Immaculate Heart in her hand. And under the left arm of the cross, in large letters, like crystalline water which flowed over the altar, forming these words, grace and mercy. So again, the last detail on that far right hand corner of this vision, this last vision that she had, was that from one of the wounds of Christ, one of the arms of the crucifix, was these words, grace and mercy. And the words were water. The words were formed in water. So this, of course, is a symbol of baptism and the abundant life-giving waters that Jesus himself pours out. And the Blessed Virgin Mary also gives us the pure waters of grace. She is the mediatrix of the graces that God gives to us because she gave us Jesus himself, who is our salvation. So there you have it. I have described some of the amazing correlations between the Book of Esther and the apparitions of Our Lady of Fatima. There are others. It would take a whole Bible study, and so perhaps someday we'll do a Bible study of the Book of Esther. There is a document that I've put out on our parish website, which you can read for yourself. God bless all of you, and I wish you a very happy month of May, the month of Our Lady. God bless all of you, and a happy Easter season to you all.
Amen.